Let me start briefly with three questions that I'd love to discuss. I can tell you a little bit about what we've learned at Garena, but I want to elevate the conversation a bit and talk about, I think, three topics that are close to our heart and I think should be close to your heart as well. The first is, where does all this end up in 10 years? I spent over 10 years of my life at General Atlantic as a technology investor, and I remember vividly looking at our very first deals in India in the 1990s, China in the early 2000s, and I can candidly tell you that with full humility, we didn't fully appreciate how big it would become. My question is very simple. How big will the market cap of local internet companies in Southeast Asia be? The answer might surprise you. The second key question I want to talk about is, what will be the best business models? What does that actually mean? And very much to Mukul's point, my friend Mukul's point, it is so different than what the product is. What is the industrial economic logic for what will be great business models in the next 10 years here in Southeast Asia? And then lastly, what's the missing reagent in the equation? There's so much great ideation and capital formation and company formation. What could you add into that walk to make the food grow faster, to make the food get cooked faster? What should we be thinking about? And I'll try to weave that into what I share with you in terms of the lessons that we've learned along the way. Let me start with Garena. It has been a complete team effort. Forrest, our founder, launched the business in 2009 with a group of friends in a small shop house in Singapore with just a few $100,000 of personal savings. And over the years, the business has grown almost entirely organically at a very, very rapid clip. And we're very proud of the fact that even though we're a US dollar-denominated reporter from our financial perspective, we've still been able to grow to 95% CAGR over this period of time and want to keep driving organic growth in our business across what we do. I think part of why we've been able to grow so quickly has been the serendipity and the good fortune of being here in Southeast Asia. We call it Greater Southeast Asia because the 9-dashed line notwithstanding, we think of Taiwan as being an integral part of the community, the cultural region of Southeast Asia, the economic region, certainly the political region of Southeast Asia for the current day. And when you think about why Southeast Asia is so exciting, a lot of it hinges on demographics, and the old sort of cliche that demographics are destiny, but it is very, very true. And when you look at the aggregate population growth, not just in total, but of working-age, productive adults in different parts of the world, we have amongst the best population growth globally. And it is a fantastic, call it a demographic dividend, call it a natural tailwind for the businesses in this region that we should be taking full advantage of. And when you then layer that on with raw economic growth on top of population growth, which is what the left side of this chart indicates, and then, of course, further layer on device penetration, we think that the territory is very fertile for the next 10 or 15 years of internet-based businesses. You cannot have internet and mobile platforms without the internet and without mobile phones and mobile telephony. We're seeing tremendous growth over here. Now, this, I think, in some ways betrays unevenness, lumpiness, country by country. A perfect example of this is the dichotomy between Vietnam and Indonesia, or Vietnam and the Philippines, where among many, many emerging markets in the world, the Vietnamese have been among the most forward-thinking in pushing out broadband into their population and pushing out mobile telephony. And it was an amazing fact just a couple of years ago that you could buy an unlimited 3G plan in Vietnam for less than $5 a month, whereas that exact same plan would either be unavailable or with extremely high packet loss and high latency, or just expensive in places like the Philippines and Indonesia. Unevenness notwithstanding, though, we see a film that's unfolding very similar to the film that was reeled in China 5 or 6 years ago across internet penetration, mobile penetration, and e-commerce saturation of retail. One of the themes that we've felt is very, very important for our business, and it echoes what Mukul was talking about, is at the end of the day, business model and the industrial economics of what you do. We unabashedly are fans of gross margin as a metric, and if we're more nuanced about it, it's return on invested capital. Internet is a business. We are business people. Cash generation relative to the amount of capital sequestered in the business is incredibly important, and I think as an illustration of that, we were very fortunate that our entire business got to break even with just $17 million, 17 million US of capital. It's partly why we had a seed round in 2009, we had a Series A round in 2010, and then we did not add another investor into the business until I fought my way into the business in 2014. 4 years later as the Series B. And this is incredibly important because across the span of time, whether it's eBay that famously kept the $5 million from benchmark in its bank account in perpetuity, or Google that reached break-even very quickly, the very best business models achieve a degree of profitability and cash generation early in their development and then reinvest that for growth. There are 3 great examples of this in China that we think have exportability to Southeast Asia. Of course, everyone's heard of the acronym B, A, and T. Out of those, though, B is a challenging business model to bring to Southeast Asia, Baidu, because in many ways it exists in a unique environment in mainland China. However, we think that the Alibaba asset-light marketplace model carries over very well. We think that the Alipay core payments business, which ties into closed loops, plays very well in Southeast Asia. And finally, the Tencent model, which synthesizes together chat platforms and digital content, plays very well. And our ambition is to be in each of these three businesses. I can report today that we're pleased with how this is turning out, but we have a hell of a lot of work still to do. In the digital content business, business number 3, we're now the largest by market share in Southeast Asia and roughly between 25 and 30% of the market. In our Shopee e-commerce business, I'll share with you the statistics momentarily, but we're now, we believe, the largest player that's a pure asset-light model that's covering all of greater Southeast Asia with well over 800 million of GMV in just 12 months post-launch. And finally, for AirPay, depending on how you circumscribe that market, we're probably the number 2 player in terms of gross transaction value. That's, again, focusing on the Southeast Asia region. So these are businesses where there is an element of winner-take-all or winner-take-most, but more importantly, there's an element of building great platforms and great enduring businesses across the region. I'll pick up the pace a little bit and share with you now a couple of things that we've picked up as we've gone through our business building process. The first is the incredible importance of going deeply local. And I don't just mean having a Jakarta strategy or having a Manila strategy. You've got to be in what people would sort of call demographically the tier 4, tier 5 cities. We would just say you've got to be in every village. You've got to have feet on the street, boots on the ground, and the emulation model in ASEAN should less be Google and Facebook, certainly in the local field operations. It should be more Unilever. It should be people that have really built very powerful businesses down to every end cap in every supermarket, and that's been a hallmark of how we've built our business on the ground. The second is, I think, thinking about how we think about our e-commerce business, I think in general, the verbiage and the nomenclature of this business does us a lot of disservices as an industry, as a community of entrepreneurs. I don't think anybody really understands what B2B means, or C2C, or P2P, or even B2B2C. These are just concatenations of letters strung together without a lot of insight into what the actual economics are. We think about it in a very different way, and this is how we think about it internally. It's all about 2 fundamental operational decisions you have to make. The first decision is, are you going to be asset light or are you going to be asset heavy? And it's seductive to be asset heavy because you think you can control your destiny. The inventory sits on your balance sheet. You're capturing direct gross margin on the goods. You've got everything sort of under your watch, but it also has a tremendous cost in terms of the balance sheet. Likewise, you have a decision to make, which is, are you going to be triple C heavy, which is consumer electronics, computers, cell phones, and cameras, which again is very seductive because these often are easy to buy online transactions. They can grow your GMV, if that's the metric you're focused on, very rapidly. Or do you want to be non-triple C heavy? Now, the interesting thing is this maps against my earlier comments on return on invested capital. Think of the y-axis as the on-invested capital bit, and the x-axis as the return bit. And it's no surprise that consumer electronics tend to be a 6 or 7% gross margin business, whereas everything else, whether it be fashion, apparel, home and living, babies, and so on and so forth, that kind of stuff tends to be more in the 25 to 45% gross margin category. So if your return is higher and your investment is lower, that ought to be the best place to play, and it is. From a market cap standpoint, in China, Alibaba has a $200 billion market cap, largely anchored around Taobao and Tmall, which are exactly this kind of model, whereas JD has a $35 billion market cap because it falls in the lower left category. And there are a handful of examples of others around Southeast Asia and the world that have tried different approaches to make the chess game work, but there are ultimately only 4 places to play in this world. And the choice you make at the very beginning has a huge implication on your choice of technology, your choice of how you engage with the consumer, and your ability to migrate. And in general, it's very difficult to move up and to the right in this model. Once you are stuck with an electronics-heavy, male-heavy demographic that purchases once or twice a year based on discounting, it's very difficult to go after the sweet spot, which is the fashion-oriented, often more demographically female-leaning, asset-light customer with many, many, many millions of SKUs. And we've learned this the hard way in how we've built our business, but today, I'm very happy to announce that our Shopee business, could you just go up a page, guys? Sorry, just page up for me, I double-clicked. Just go up a page. Yeah. I'm proud to share with you that this business has now reached almost 900 million of GMV. In fact, we just had our first $3 million GMV single day, which would put us over $1 billion on that particular day. And the reason is the choice of business model and the choice of market segment. Going after non-triple C, going after an asset-light model, and then hyper localizing the business into each of the relevant countries in Southeast Asia. And I think we've upset the conventional wisdom, which is that you have to own the entire supply chain to have a great customer experience. A good example of that is on the upper right, where, depending on whose marketing campaign is more busy in a given day, there was a particular day that we happened to be the #1 downloaded app in the App Store in Indonesia, but more importantly, we were the only 5-star rated app. And that has a lot to do with the choice of model and the way in which the buyers and sellers are engaging with each other. And I just want to share with you, again, something that I shared not to sort of in any way put ourselves on a pedestal. We've made more mistakes than all of you in this room combined. But to share with you, I think, a sense of optimism that Southeast Asia can really create great businesses and great business opportunities. Again, let's depersonalize it from Garena and Shopee specifically, but in general, one of my friends loves to say that in Southeast Asia, we often have a bit of an insecurity complex relative to China and India, that's where the really big companies are, and perhaps they'll come and buy one of our businesses, or perhaps they'll invest in it. I think we can sit on the same table with them. I think we can build really great businesses, and the proof of that is the following. So back in the early 2000s, Alibaba launched Taobao, and back in the 90s, of course, eBay was launched, and that was a different moment in time. The technology industry was younger, but to be clear, those are also billion-person countries in the case of China and multi-trillion-dollar economies in the case of the US. They went after a web-based customer segment, and in their very first year of launch, so normalizing it to when they were babies, Alibaba did 3 million of GMV in its first year, eBay did under 10, Mercado Libre did 20, and we were very fortunate in our first year, which only began in June 2015, so the first 6 months of that calendar year, we did 57, and the end of the year was 211. And it just goes to show how much more quickly a business in Southeast Asia can grow. And despite the fact that we limited ourselves to smartphone app customers, there is no web version of Shopee for the consumer. We may get there eventually, but we were limiting ourselves with one hand behind our back. And if you look at the next couple of years of growth, it's kind of interesting to see how the storyline continues. eBay did about 100 in their second calendar year, Lazada did about 100, Alibaba did 150, Lazada then did about 380 in their third year of operations and about $1 billion in their fourth. Amazon did about 600 of net rev, and to be clear, net rev is different than GMV, but between friends is a little bit of a spread there. Our current run rate is 850, and this is a business that's 12.3 months old right now. So I'm proud of the fact that Southeast Asia can accomplish something very, very special. This is a homegrown Southeast Asian business with Khazanah as a shareholder, built in the region, for the region, by the region, and we're growing faster than any other business that we've ever seen in e-commerce. And again, to be very clear, we're doing it in 2015 and 16. The world is much more developed now. Smartphones are in full saturation. But still, I think it's special that Southeast Asia can do something this special. To give you a bit of an illustration of how this goes, a big part of it is about virality. So we track maniacally how many of our customers, our sellers and our buyers, come to Shopee because they clicked on a link on Mark's website or Sergey and Larry's website, or how many came because they came through word of mouth. And increasingly, a very, very large percentage, in some cases more than 50% each month, are coming through word of mouth, which really lowers the cash consumption and the capital intensity of the business. And the results you can see for Indonesia are just wonderful, where there's more and more catch-up on the board as the months go by. Here's what it looked like in Thailand. September was the month that it really went viral in Thailand for Shopee. Here's what it looks like in Vietnam, and you can see despite having almost a Chilean sort of geography, we've been able to saturate up and down from the top to the bottom. And then Taiwan, another very important market for us, the entire populated western coastline has been very deeply saturated by buyers and by sellers, which is very special for us because you want that nuance, that interlocking multi-sided platform dynamic between buyers and sellers. And the second nuance here is, well, look, it's fine for people to sort of transact, but customers have to pay, and that's the second big insight about how Asia internet is very different than US internet. If you look at the P&L and the 10Ks for Google and Facebook and Twitter, you will see businesses that are 90% plus advertising driven. If you look at Tencent's P&L, you'll see a business that's probably 75% content driven, user pay driven, as opposed to advertising. Advertising is a perfectly valid business model, don't get me wrong, but if you are reliant on it, your revenue per MAU, per monthly active user, will always be about a third of what it can be. And the proof of that is if you look at Tencent's revenue per user and Facebook's revenue per user in just Asia, and that includes everything, in Japan, Korea, but just Asia, it's about 3 to 1. And the proof of that in the Western environments is the difference in profitability between an MSO, like a Time Warner Cable or a pay TV operator, and a free-to-air TV business. You always want the user to be paying because then you can really maximize value creation. Now, to do that, you got to be able to pay for it. And we have a fundamental problem in Southeast Asia, which is not logistics. Logistics is actually pretty good. We have been shipping things for 30,000 years in Southeast Asia. We're good at it. The bigger issue is payment, because only 10% of the population in Southeast Asia has a credit card. And perhaps an additional 25% of the population has a bank account but not a credit card. And that leads to a lot of inefficiency. So we've had to build our own in-house capability to do this, and now we're sharing that with all of our business partners and others in the economy, and that business has become roughly the second largest fintech business in Southeast Asia, about 400 million of annualized transaction volume in about 24 months since we launched it. And again, in a very uniquely ASEAN kind of way, you couldn't just recreate Alipay, you couldn't just recreate PayPal, it had to be ASEAN, it had to be local. So in countries like Vietnam and Thailand, we let people use cash, and we have over 100,000 little locations where storekeepers can receive cash, and in about 20 milliseconds, that cash gets put into somebody's wallet. It's still the customer's money. The tragedy is that up until now, the customer hasn't been able to spend it anywhere more than an arm's length radius or a 20 or 30-minute driving radius. We want to create transparency of markets kilometer to kilometer as the region expands, and that involves digital payments. Finally, we have our core business, or our oldest business is a better way to say it, which we launched in 2009, and that's the synthesis of a communications platform, which was the very beginning of it, and then a content delivery platform, including esports, which has become a very important trend for the internet on a global basis. And this business, in many ways, was built in Tencent's image, and we've had tremendous, very constructive and positive mentorship from them all the way since 2009-10, when they first became a partner of ours. And this business continues to grow fantastically. It grew over 30% in 2015. I think we see this business perhaps even accelerating in its growth rate as mobile becomes an important part of the content equation for people. So let me return to the three key questions. And let me start with the first one, which is, for investors in the room, for entrepreneurs in the room, for governments in the room, how big can this be? So let me show you the math from China. Start with GDP. GDP in China is about 4 times larger than GDP in GSEA, Greater Southeast Asia, just dollar for dollar. And the definition of GDP is its gross domestic product. For the financial folks in the room, it's basically the sum of EBITDA in the country. It's gross EBITDA for the entire country. The depreciation of CapEx does not figure into it, but just keep that as sort of a rough metric. It's not a revenue metric, it's a cash flow metric. So if you scale up or scale down your GDP, you're also scaling up or scaling down the value creation opportunity for the country. What does that mean? Well, look at China. Let's keep it very simple. 200 billion for Alibaba, 200 billion for Tencent, 60 for Alipay with a little bit of double counting, 60 for Baidu. All right, so we're at 520 right now. And call it 80 for everybody else, Meituan and everybody else that sort of decays in the power law. Call it 600 of market cap for internet and mobile companies, excluding the telcos. Fine. If Southeast Asia has 1/4 that size, we ought to have 150 billion of equity value creation in Southeast Asia. Now, to be clear, we're not going to get all that. Some of that will go to Google. Some of that will go to Facebook. Some of that will go to Agoda, which is owned by Priceline, and so on and so forth. But shame on us if in this room we can't get our fair share of that through local companies with local technology and local approaches to business. Not because we need to be protected, not because we need to be regulated, but because we can win competitively, because this is our home market. And if we can't figure it out, no one should be able to figure it out. This is very, very important. This is the goal we're going for. We should not be thinking about $300, $400 million company creation. We should be thinking about, out of $150 billion, who will get that in the next 5 to 10 years, and how can we build these businesses? That's point number one. I think point number two is business model, and you've heard me talk a lot about the idea of platforms. And I think there's a specific document I want each of you to take a look at. In fact, the guy that wrote this won the Nobel Prize in 2014. There's a paper by Rocher and Tirole, which was the defining articulation of what a platform business is. And he explained, that these two gentlemen explained, I think for the very first time, in clear language, why eBay works the way it does, why Taobao works the way it does. And there are implications for pricing, for strategy, for M&A that are very, very important. We should be focusing on building these platforms, as opposed to simply building components that go into somebody else's platform. It would be a shame if the next 10 years were much like the preceding 40 years, in that we built hard drive metal stamping businesses, we bought companies that could wound coil together at low cost. We weren't building platforms. We must be building platforms. And the last thing I would observe in terms of what is missing in the ecosystem, and I give Khazanah a tremendous amount of credit for actually addressing what I'm about to mention, is my colleagues and I like to describe it as the Series B and Series C valley of death. There are lots of people that will provide triple F funding for your seed round. That's friends, family, and fools. that will invest in the seed round of any company. That's the first $1 million. You can always get it in almost any part of the world. You can certainly get it here. There are lots of people that will provide Series A, like Yinglan and others in this room. But Series B capital is a $20 to $25 million check that's equity, not debt, and that's constructively geared to get you to your profitability point. There is a real lack of that in Southeast Asia. There are countries in this region where you can't even raise that money. You have to go straight to private equity or to a strategic, sell your business, or just compromise your growth story. And if someone's coming in from abroad with capital, that really hurts your business. So what we need is roughly 3 firms in this region with 400 to 500 million of AUM in a single fund, which lets them diversify over 20 to 25 investments of $20 to $25 million each. That's what we need. It is asking too much for a Series A investor to write $20 million. That's not what they do. They're too committed, they're too under-diversified. But if we had 3 of these funds in the region, man, it would solve the problem. And many of the entrepreneurs in this room wouldn't have to stress as much about raising that Series B or even Series C round because they'd have someone whose business it was to do that. We don't have that right now in this market, except for what Khazana's doing to a certain extent and a handful of others. That's a big issue. Let me pause there. I think 3 provocative questions, 3 specific perspectives on it. And I hope that as you leave the room, you'll think about how can my company be in that 150 billion? How do we capture that locally as opposed to having that be captured by global platforms, typically in the 650, 415 area codes in the US? What can we do? That's the question I want you all to be thinking about as you leave the room. Thank you.